Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old masturbather. The old masturbather. We've been masturbating through the coronavirus. We've masturbated straight through 3 years of the Trump administration. We've been masturbating long before that. We've been masturbating basically since we were old enough to masturbate. And we don't know how to do anything else. So today we thought we'd talk. I wanted to talk about I try not to use the royal we. I don't know. I want to talk about a writer I loved when I was young, and I've kind of gone. I kind of was embarrassed that I liked Richard Brautigan. There was a certain period where people would say not kind of nasty things about Richard Brautigan, and I wouldn't really respond too much. And then later I would sort of say that I thought he was a good writer, and people would make fun of me for it, and I would say, yeah, I would just shrug. But I'm a little stronger in my support for Brautigan, who I rereading recently. We did a piece on him about a year ago now, which was part of our ever popular series of somewhat down and yay, nay and yay series. And it was Kerouac No, and I hate Kerouac more than ever, especially when Kerouac fans write into the bathtub and tell me about how intellectually superior he was to everybody. This ridiculous old guy. Kerouac, I can live without Kerouac. I can't stand Burroughs. I kind of sometimes like Ginsberg. I think they were just a bunch of pains in the ass. But I do think Brautigan, who came along around the same, a little late in that group, was kind of made fun of for being kind of silly and for having these kind of silly, kind of stylish covers for his books. And he was quite popular in the '60s and early '70s, and then sort of lost it. But I've been kind of going back to reread him and enjoying it. And about a year ago, we talked about a Confederate general from Big Sur, which is I think that the test of time for a writer is 50 years after they wrote these books, they still make you laugh out loud, and I just laugh out loud. I shriek with laughter sometimes in a Brautigan story or a novel, and at the same time, they're quite moving. They're very haunting. So anyway, I've also been slowly reading through what I think is another kind of badly treated biography, William Hjortsberg's biography called Jubilee Hitchhiker. And I remember when it came out, and friends have told me who saw more reviews than I do, because I don't really read reviews, I tend to write them rather than read them, that it was kind of badly treated. This is a wonderful biography. I love it, but I can't read in one 2-week period. It's very detailed. It goes into almost day by day accounts of trips he took. It's very well and clearly written. It's not written like a kind of clever biography. It's written kind of like a really good narrative story. And then about the history of the people of the time that Brautigan knew. And I think Hjortsberg, who was a friend of Brautigan, another thing, I'm always wary of a book written by a friend of somebody they're writing about. I think Hjortsberg does a really good job of being affectionate, being personal, and then explaining the life of this man who he did like. I hit a certain passage that made me laugh. I'm only about a third of the way through it. A couple days ago, I hit this passage, which is when Brautigan's first novel, the first novel he finished, and we're going to talk about, was Trout Fishing in America. It was his first novel. I put those. See all those. That means I want to read those passages. All those rags sticking out. And this was the first novel he wrote, the first novel he published was Confederate General from Big Sur, which was based on a friend of his named Lee Mellon, who was a real crazy character. A lot of people knew, terrible drunk, kind of a pain in the ass, but kind of a brilliant character who just died recently, just like 2 years ago, up in Monterey. That's a long way of saying there's a little passage about somebody stopping by Brautigan's house and seeing him working on a novel in the other room, and Richard Brautigan said to his friend, "My new novel's in there. I kind of stroll in occasionally, write a few quick paragraphs, and get out before the novel knows what I'm doing. If novels ever found out that you're writing them, you're done for." He whispered this. It's a memoir for meeting the guy, for being with him. It's a perfect Brautigan metaphor because it sounds ridiculous that you don't want the novel to know you're writing about it. At the same time, it's funny, and it's actually, as a novelist, That's exactly how I write a novel. You don't want to take it too seriously, and you don't want to let it know you're paying a lot of attention to it. You just want to kind of sneak in and out. It's a lovely book. I'm going to be doing more on this as we read through it. I want to read through the entirety of Brautigan's work. Later on, shortly after that, he was working on a Christmas story. He went around one Christmas, and all he did was take pictures of Christmas. It was called 390 Photographs of Christmas Trees. And he went around San Francisco taking pictures of Christmas. People throw their Christmas trees out in the garbage. He took 390 pictures. And I know it sounds, people think he's being too whimsical, but it's like a perfect picture of Christmas. All these dead Christmas trees thrown in the garbage. And it's funny. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about, I've just I'm rereading my way through Brautigan. His first true novel was Trout Fishing in America. It's the one he was best known for. I have my masturbating assistant here. And he was sort of known, one of the things that people made fun of him for later was and he was kind of well known for when he first published them, were these silly little pictures of himself and his girlfriends. And they always dressed kind of weird. And they're kind of 60s hippie types living in San Francisco. And Trout Fishing in America, I have not read since I was 16. It's really funny. It's beautifully written. I mean, I said this in the last one, I'm sure. Kerouac, he just poured this crap onto the paper, and we're supposed to like respond like he's speaking from Buddha. Brautigan spent a lot of time on his sentences and his paragraphs and his little chapters, and they have beginnings and ends. They're odd, they're funny, they're strange, and they're always human. They're always about something very human and affectionate. Now, as a person, I think one of the problems with Brautigan is that he was a very unhappy man, as you can see this from this biography. Through much of his life, he came from a really strange background. His father, he never knew his father, and his father never even knew Brautigan was his son, according to the man who the mother claimed was his father. He had mental illness, clearly. He drank too much. He had serious drinking problems in his life, and he still managed to write these beautiful books. The reports about Brautigan from people who knew him and loved him was that he was a lovely man to be with. He was a lot of fun, and he could be horrible, like really, really terrible drunks. So that has also made his reputation difficult. One of the early champions of Brautigan was Donald Barthelme. We've talked about Barthelme a bit in the past, and we'll do some more with Barthelme. But I think it's funny because Barthelme kind of came out of the 60s with this very high reputation. And he's very seriously regarded now. He was published in all the best magazines, and he's still treated like this almost reverent figure. Even though when I teach him in classes, my students can't stand him. I find that my students don't like him. But I do like Barthelme. I think he's pretty funny. He's very similar to Brautigan, the surrealistic elements, the sentences, the comedy, and the oddball whimsy of his stories. He was also more productive than Barthelme. And he was a big, than Brautigan. And when he was editing, he actually tried to publish and did publish some of Brautigan's early work, which is quite funny because you just see a lot of similarities. I would say, if I looked at these two together, that Brautigan is a far superior writer. A really, really careful and a real craftsman and a really, really human writer. The writer he seemed to most enjoy or most wanted to emulate, and who he reminds me a great deal of, is Hemingway, particularly the early Hemingway. The sentences, the very, very careful emotional sense of each sentence as it occurs. And you really have to read Barthelme almost as a sentence by sentence. You can't skim a single scene from Barthelme, which I also think is a great sign for a writer. And there's a similar voice that comes through them all. I don't want to go on too long. This is going to be too long, I know. Oh my gosh, already too long. But all I wanted to say was that while I was reading this, all I could think about was reading the passages out loud. You really can't get Brautigan unless you read him out loud. And I wanted to read a few passages at the risk of going too long. I don't even remember the context. So Trout Fishing in America is just a lot of little episodic adventures in the life of a Brautigan-like person who goes around trout fishing with his wife and his baby often and with friends, and then he meets people and he makes kind of jokes. Trout fishing in America eventually becomes a character in it who comes and goes, and he meets people who met trout fishing in America. And it's really a sense that being in America is at its best this kind of rural, simple, affectionate life with the world. And every scene reverberates with that kind of idea. At one point, he talks about staying in a shack. I wanted to read a couple of passages and give you a little flavor. This is page 10. A little ways up from the shack was an outhouse, with its door flung violently open. The inside of the outhouse was exposed like a human face, and the outhouse seemed to say, "The guy who built me crapped in here 9,745 times, and he's dead now, and I don't want anyone else to touch me. He was a good guy. He built me with loving care. Leave me alone. I'm a monument now to a good ass gone under. There's no mystery here. That's why the door's open. If you have to crap, go in the bushes like a deer." "Fuck you," I said to the outhouse. I don't want to try to explain it, but it's a human moment. The way he sees objects in the world are human, and who is connected to those objects. And they're not ridiculous metaphors. I remember people thinking, well, he's just too ridiculous. He's not ridiculous. Whereas I think Barthelme's stuff never communicates that sense of emotion to me. I've got so many passages in here. There's one called the Kool-Aid Wino. The Kool-Aid Wino at one point always goes to bed with his clothes on. He says he never takes his clothes off because he says, "Why bother? You're only going to get up anyway." These are people that Brautigan really knew. And he saves every little bit and puts them into these little lovely little stories. I'm just going to browse through here quickly. I got all these little flags. I'm not going to do them all. I just want to say that if in tumultuous times, and he was writing in tumultuous times, there's a sort of acceptance of those horrible things happening around you and a sense of human life underneath it that is very, very emotional and very affectionate. And I think it came from the heart of a person who had a very difficult way of dealing with the world. I think he probably did have problems, and he worked very hard to establish a pleasant relationship with the world. There's one called Mr. Heyman. I'll just read a first paragraph. This is an old fart named Mr. Heyman. He says, "Heyman Creek was named for Charles Heyman, a sort of half-assed pioneer in a country that not many wanted to live in because it was poor and ugly and horrible." He built a shack, this was in 1876, on a little creek that drained a worthless hill. After a while, the creek was called Heyman Creek. Mr. Heyman did not know how to read or write and considered himself better for it. Mr. Heyman did odd jobs for years and years and years and years. Your mule's broke? Get Mr. Heyman to fix it. Your fences are on fire? Get Mr. Heyman to put them out. Mr. Heyman lived on a diet of stone ground wheat and kale. It's like this tough little pioneer. And, he comes from these people. Brautigan comes from a really rough background. And he's got a sense of humor about him, and he's got a joke about him. There's one point where he meets a trout. It's a hunchback trout. There's a chapter about a hunchback trout. He says after he catches the trout, he says, I only wish I could have made a death mask of him. To make a death mask for a dead trout. I mean, it's not silly. His stuff is not silly. It's whimsical and it's comic. It's very comic. And it's very, it does remind me, I'm not a big Twain fan, but it reminds me more of Twain than of Barthélemy, and as far as the heart. There's a real heart in it. At one point, he stops in a store. I was almost every page, there was passages I wanted to read. We stopped at a store in Stanley. I bought a candy bar and asked how the trout fishing was in Cuba. He's just trying to wind up this old lady about Cuba, because Cuba's communist. The woman at the store said, "You're better off dead, you commie bastard." I got a receipt for the candy bar to be used for income tax purposes. The idea, the anger of this woman, and his reaction to anger is always this kind of complacent. I got a tax receipt. There's so many passages. At one point, he describes a hotel lobby and where the furniture in the lobby, it was the only furniture I have ever seen in my life that looks like baby food. Bartholomew has these crazy metaphors, but I honestly feel I see the world. I see the actual world that Brautigan saw when he says these things. There's a very funny passage of some drunks talking about it, what booze they need, how much booze they need to drink to remember things. It's a very funny passage, but I won't read it. There's so many wonderful metaphors about kids. There's one about I can't remember. At one point, there's a metaphor of a little kid running around hyper, and Brautigan says something like, he was like a bat at the World's Fair. I'm sorry, I'm really laughing too hard. A bat, it's not a ridiculous metaphor. It's actually, I actually see this kid running around. He has another one here with his baby, his little baby is running around, and it's hyped up and it's been vomiting all the way up on this trip into the mountains. And he says at one point she picks up a big trout and she's wandering around playing with his dead trout. And he says she was carrying it like a harp on her way to a concert. I'm telling you, all through this, I'm just laughing out loud and wanting. I had twice as many of these. I'm going to end on one thing. There's so many passages I love in this. I would really recommend reading a passage called The Towel from 138 to 139. It's a one-page short story, and it's about finding a photograph in a ranger station out in the woods, and just a description of that. And it's a little story about looking back at the past and how time passes. It's very moving. This is something at one point he's in a cabin and he goes through the papers of some old boxes of papers and he finds some old codger from 100 years ago has kept a record of all the trout he didn't catch. Every time he goes trout fishing, he didn't catch any trout. They all got away. And there's just records year after year. And at the end, I want to end this with this last passage. It's a little coda that this old fart wrote at the end of his diary of trouts he'd never caught. And it's a picture of a certain type of American, which I hope most of us are. I've had it. I've gone fishing now for 7 years, and I haven't caught a single trout. I've lost every trout I ever hooked. They either jump off, or twist off, or squirm off, or break my leader, or flop off, or fuck off. I have never even gotten my hands on a trout. For all its frustration, I believe it was an interesting experiment in total loss. But next year, somebody else will have to go trout fishing. Somebody else will have to go out there. And for a writer who's sort of treated as kind of a silly hippie, Brautigan wrote some beautiful stuff about American life and American aspirations to do something with our totally fucked up lives. I love Brautigan, and we're going to keep reading him through the next pandemic. Take care, stay safe. Don't be afraid to raise hell, and we're here in the bathtub if you need us. Just give us a shout. Take care.